you've been doing this for a while, chances are you know what to do right now to grow your business or to find better clients or to get more money. You know intuitively what to do, but something gets in the way. And most of the time, the thing that gets in the way is fear. You have a conversation with a prospective client and it doesn't feel like the right thing. You pick up some kind of vibe on that call and you know this is going to create more pain and stress for you. I really do believe that it takes immense courage to follow your intuition and do something that you can't necessarily explain why you're doing at the time. How do we find the courage to trust our intuition? Well, hello, welcome to another episode of the Creative Courage Podcast. My name is Matt Essam, and today I want to talk to you about intuition. Now, this is a word that gets thrown around a lot, especially in the coaching world and the personal development world. And I've been thinking about this concept. And the reason I think it's important to talk about today is because over the last decade of coaching some of the world's leading creatives, people that spent decades at Disney and then went and started their own branding studio, people that have worked at Spotify and been responsible for rebranding the likes of Elvis Presley and Whitney Houston for Sony Music. These are people who are at the top of their game creatively. And one of the most interesting things is that they often come to me almost looking for permission. It's like deep down, they have an idea about what they need to do. Deep down, they kind of know that they should have said that they didn't want to work with that client, or they should have hired or fired that team member earlier. And I think really when I personally think about the word intuition, that's ultimately what comes up. It's this knowing, this idea that really we know what to do, but something gets in the way. And most of the time, the thing that gets in the way is fear. And that's why I'm so obsessed at the moment, I guess, with this idea of courage, because courage is almost like the antidote that can be applied to basically everything in life and business. It's like if we had the courage to follow our intuition more, I think personally we'd be living more fulfilling, financially rewarding, creative lives. And I just wanted to kind of open a discussion today, something for you to think about. And also for me personally, this is a journey that I'm currently going on. And 2025 is going to be about two key ideas and two principles for me. Number one is intuition, and number two is courage. And the reason these principles are so important is because I believe if you've been running your business for a while, or even if you haven't been running it for that long, but you've been working in the creative industry for a while, there are things that you've picked up along your journey, experiences that you've had, people that you've met, projects that you've worked on, books that you've read, places that you traveled, that have given you a huge amount of collective knowledge that predominantly lives within your subconscious brain. And it's that knowledge that I think we often underestimate. And it's that knowledge that informs this idea of intuition, this idea that we just kind of know what to do, but it's not like a really conscious thought process. And so the reason I wanted to take an episode to talk about this is because I want to examine A, what stops myself and my clients following their intuition more, and B, what intuition really means. Like what is intuition, and how do we know if it's intuition, or how do we know if it's some kind of subconscious programming from our childhood that's just going to lead us down the same pathway and the same pattern? And so to give a little bit of structure to this episode, I want to talk about those things, but in a slightly different order. So first of all, what is intuition and why is it important? And then secondly, what stops most of us following our intuition more? And then finally, just a little bit about how I'm going to experiment with this in 2025 and some principles that I'm going to be following, and ultimately a journey that I want to share with you because I think it will be valuable and interesting. So let's kind of start with the first part. Like, why is it important that we follow our intuition, and what does it actually feel like? Like, how do we know it's intuition? So, one of the key concepts that I often battle with is this idea of kind of logic and best practice versus intuition. And there was a book that I read probably about a year ago now, and I can't remember the author, but I'll link to it in the show notes below. And it was called Don't Trust Your Gut. And it was all about this concept that as humans, we're not very good at making decisions based on intuition, and statistically based on things like divorce rates, based on accidents in airplane crashes versus accidents on the road. Like, statistically, we emotionally, at least, aren't very good at making decisions. And I found the book really interesting because I was like, oh, actually, maybe this intuition thing isn't as important, or it doesn't give us as much tangible kind of evidence to make decisions around. But then I started thinking, what really is a good or a bad decision? And often in the moment, we don't know. We might feel like something went our way, but it might turn out down the road to be a bad thing, or something that didn't actually turn out the way that we wanted it to be. So then I started thinking about, well, these logical decisions, like this logically makes sense, but what is this feeling that we get that sometimes is counterintuitive to the logic? And I know personally in my life, there's been lots of things where logically that would have been the most sensible path, shall we say. And I'm thinking about specifically in my younger years. I went to university, and the first degree that I chose was computing and business. And I chose that degree because logically it felt like a very sensible degree. I had done some computing at school. I know that computers weren't going anywhere. And I know that if you combined computing and business, they were great formulas for success, right? Some of the most successful or biggest companies in the world have been built on that. Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, you name it. So I was like, oh, that's what I'll do. But as I made that decision, something didn't quite feel right. It didn't really feel like the thing that I wanted to be doing, but I told myself it was the most sensible decision, or it was the most logical decision. Now, I only really lasted about a year doing that course. Firstly, because it was just so difficult and it was way above my ability that I had brought from school. But second of all, just because I didn't really enjoy it. I didn't really want to be there. I felt like I wanted to be doing something else. And I'm sure you've had a moment like this in your life, and it could be related to relationships. It could be related to work, but it's something where logically and from the outside, it very much looks like the right decision, but intuitively it feels wrong. And so the question is, what stops us listening to that intuition, or what stops us listening to that feeling and keeps us in this kind of logical way of thinking? And my guess from my experience is that it really is just fear. It's this fear that we don't really know where that information is coming from, that if something logically makes sense, then it's probably the best decision. And if other people agree with that decision, then, or even encourage that decision, then if it doesn't work out, maybe we're going to face less repercussion from a social and emotional perspective, right? So I know for me personally, although my family and friends pretty much support any decisions that I make, I'm quite lucky. I don't have parents that pressured me in a particular way. I don't have friends that constantly question my decisions or anything like that. But I definitely felt a pressure kind of from society and from friends and from people to do certain things in a certain way. And if I went with what was just my intuition and was just a kind of gut feeling and it didn't work out, I think I was afraid that people might think that I had made a bit of a stupid choice. And I always remember when I was growing up, I always heard examples of people that made bad choices, whether it was in a career sense, or whether it was kind of taking the wrong path in terms of like a social scene, or, whatever it was. And it's kind of this feeling. And for me, the difference is really between kind of head, gut, and heart. And there was a really cool concept that I heard years ago about these kind of three places that we make decisions from. There's this kind of like logical place in our mind, which is like what makes sense logically. Then there's like the emotional place, which is kind of our heart. And that's really just like a feeling. But then there's like our gut instinct. Like, what is our gut telling us? And those are actually kind of three different things. And most of the time, the easy decisions are where those three things are just totally aligned. Like, logically, it makes sense. It feels good. And our intuition or our gut is telling us that it's the right thing. That's easy. Where most people get stuck, and where I've definitely got stuck in the past personally, is where the logic says one thing and the emotion and the gut says something else. And sometimes, the really, really difficult decisions are where those three are totally, misaligned. And sometimes even the logic can say one thing, but the emotion is so strong in terms of fear that almost takes over. And that's kind of why I'm talking about this idea of fear and courage, because I really do believe that it takes immense courage to follow your intuition and do something that you can't necessarily explain why you're doing at the time. And it could be as simple as you have a conversation with a prospective client and it doesn't feel like the right thing. They've got the money, they want help. It's almost like a guaranteed yes. And maybe it's like a fairly sizable project, but something about it, it's just like the way that client is or whatever. You pick up some kind of vibe on that call and this is going to be a difficult project. To be able to say no to that opportunity, like a good opportunity, because you believe that in the long term, it's going to create more pain and stress for you, and to say no to that good opportunity because you are committed to attracting incredible opportunities in your life, is something that just takes a tremendous amount of courage, because it requires a few things. It requires, number one, faith that there is something better out there than what is being presented to you right now. And number two, it takes belief that you can actually get the thing that you want. Those two things are so important. Number one, the belief that it actually exists. And number two, the belief that you can get it. And if you have those beliefs, then it's much easier to have the courage to say no to the thing that's being presented to you right now. But if you don't have that belief, then it becomes almost impossible to say no, because you believe that's the best that you can get. So there's this idea that courage runs through absolutely everything we do in our life and business. It's one of the reasons why I've called this podcast Creative Courage. And it's one of the reasons why my next book, after the one I'm currently writing, is going to be called Creative Courage. And it's going to be about how we find the courage to do certain things. In this example that I'm talking about today, it's the courage to follow our intuition, right? And so if we just kind of bring this full circle and make this super practical as well as philosophical, how do we find the courage to trust our intuition? Well, we have to first believe that our intuition is a powerful source of information. We have to believe that intuition has more knowledge than our conscious logical brain has. Now, I've not done the research on this. Like, I'm not going to quote studies, and I'm not going to, talk about this from a scientific perspective, because I just haven't done the research. But what I have done is a lot of reading over the years. And what I have done is a lot of firsthand work around this. And what I do know from a scientific perspective is that our subconscious brain processes about 8 to 10, maybe even more times the amount of information than our conscious brain. So the brain that you're listening to this podcast with and actually listening to the words, your subconscious brain is processing way more than that. It's listening to my voice, but it's also looking at what's going on around you. It's also looking out for danger. It's also regulating your nervous system. Like, it's doing all of these things, right? And so the idea is that our intuition is partly formed by all of our subconscious experiences. And so there's a theory that you actually remember from a certain age, you actually remember everything that's ever happened to you in your life. So there is a store somewhere in your brain of all of the events, all of the people that you've met in your life. Like it's stored in a particular way, a little bit like a hard drive on a computer, right? And so I kind of believe that our intuition is made up of these things. It's made up of these experiences. And so the courage to follow that intuition comes from the idea that that intuition almost knows something that we don't. Like it's processed some information in the background that our conscious brain hasn't been able to process yet. And obviously, sometimes that is from a place of previous patterns, like I spoke about at the beginning of the podcast, right? It's like we had some emotional trauma when we were younger and our brain has stored that. And there's a pattern there where like anytime this happens again, we're put on high alert. But my personal experience of that is that shows up as an emotional reaction, not an intuition. And that's why I talked about the three separate decision-making areas. Like our head is the logical, our heart, or here, I kind of feel it like just underneath my rib cage is like this emotional response. And that for me is where the fear comes from. And that's how I know the difference between intuition and fear is that I never feel it there. I never feel that's like emotional, like, oh my God, but what about if this happens? Or, oh, there's really strong emotional reaction to pull away or to do something. That's not typically how intuition shows up for me. Intuition is a feeling which is much deeper down, sort of closer to my belly button. And it's also like much more encompassing. It's this overall feeling that kind of comes through my body, which is always quite light. And it's always, without getting too spiritual, it kind of feels like it's coming from above, right? It's kind of like this feeling of like a whole body experience that's like connected to something. And it's very light. It's not a strong emotional response that feels similar to fear or anxiety or excitement or whatever. Like that for me is like the emotion. So there's like the logic, there's the emotion, and there's the intuition. And so for me, those previous programming that happens from any kind of like traumatic event or any kind of pattern that's keeping you stuck is usually an emotional pattern. It's not an intuitive pattern. I know we're going a little bit kind of deep and spiritual right now, but I think this is a really important concept. And it's an important concept because, as I said at the beginning of this podcast, if you've been doing this for a while, chances are you know what to do right now to grow your business or to find better clients or to get more money. You know intuitively what to do. And I have these conversations all the time. I had a great conversation with a guy the other day. He's been running his business for 12, 15 years. He's great at what he does. He's had some amazing campaigns. He's won some incredible awards, but he's stuck at this kind of glass ceiling where he really feels like business development and getting new clients is just a bit of a dark art. And it's kind of like sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. And he's got all of these contacts. He doesn't really know how to approach them. But when we boiled down to it, I was like, if you just listen to your intuition, like what does your intuition tell you? And he's like, my intuition tells me just to pick up the phone and just take this person out for lunch and just like reach out. And I'm like, okay, great. And so what stops you doing that? He's like, oh, well, I'm worried what people might think of me. I'm worried that I might sound desperate. Well, that worry, that's the fear, right? That's the fear kicking in. So we've kind of got this like intuition, this knowing, like I should just pick up the phone to this person, or I should just go and, you know, book a meal, or I should do this thing. There's something that's like feeling like, you know, giving me this pull towards connecting with this person. And then all of a sudden, like we have an emotional response, which is maybe fear. And these two things are linked. It's like this logical, this thinking part of the brain and this emotional part of the brain. The thinking starts going and it kicks in and it's like, oh, but what about if this happens? Or what will they think about that? And then that causes like this emotional response. And then very often we can kind of stay stuck in this loop of thinking and feeling and thinking and feeling. And the problem is, at least for me personally, and again, I'm sure there's some research around this, the emotional side of things is much more powerful than the logical and the intuition, right? So if I really feel a sense of fear or resistance towards something, or I really feel like excited about something or anxious or angry or whatever, like that's a predominant emotion that's in my body and it's a visceral thing. And it usually is the thing that determines the action that I take. I'm really, really scared of something. It takes a lot of like thinking and gritted teeth, and I'm just going to go and do this. Like it feels like a real push through this barrier. And it's designed that way, right? If we feel fear, our body and our brain is trying to keep us safe. It's trying to keep us away from the thing that potentially is dangerous, right? So the drop off the cliff or the tiger or whatever it is, like we feel that fear and it pushes us away, like physically in our body. That's why we have the fight, the flight, and the freeze, right? These are physical things that really determine our behavior because it is literally designed as a mechanism to keep us safe. And I really feel like, especially in the creative industries, half of the battle is overcoming and overriding that emotion. Half of the battle is understanding what is real and understanding what is imaginary. Like, what are the thoughts and the feelings that are stopping us doing the thing that we know we need to do intuitively? So that's my conversation today around intuition. Like, what is it? Why is it important? And what stops us from actually following our intuition more? It's a little bit more of a philosophical, psychological episode. So if you enjoyed it, I'd love to hear about it. Quite a few of you now reach out to me on LinkedIn and tell me that you've been listening to the episodes and share your thoughts and insights, which I really appreciate. So if you have been listening to a few of these episodes, or if this is your first episode today, then just find me on LinkedIn, Matt with 2 T's, Essam, E-S-S-A-M. Connect with me. Tell me in the connection message that you've been listening to the podcast, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. And this is my experiment for 2025, is what happens when we really follow our intuition more and we're able to override that thinking and those emotions that maybe keep us stuck. And how do we do that consistently? And so if you'd like to kind of follow that journey, that's what I'm going to be doing starting next year. I mean, starting today, really, but that's going to be my theme for 2025. I don't like New Year's resolutions. I think set goals all the time, be working towards something. The start of the new year isn't a good benchmark to set goals. We should be doing that all the time. But I do like principles and I like ideas. I like to have a theme or a principle or an idea for the year ahead. And I think 12 months is a great time frame to really experiment with that idea. And at the end of that 12 months, I really want to be able to say, these are the positives about following my intuition. These are the negatives. This is how I do it more. This is how I do it less. This is when I should do it. This is when I shouldn't do it. I want to understand more about intuition. I want to understand more about the power of intuition and if it is as powerful as I think it is and as a lot of people say it is. And how can we align ourselves with that intuition more? How can we take more action that is in alignment with that intuition and the things that we feel like intuitively we should be doing more of? So if you would like to follow that journey and you are not already subscribed, hit the subscribe button. If there's somebody that you think would find this episode valuable, then please do share with a friend. You've been listening to the Creative Courage Podcast, and my name is Matt Essam.